This is Mississippi Moments, produced by the Center for Oral History and Cultural Heritage at the University of Southern Mississippi and supported by the Mississippi Humanities Council. I'm Bill Ellison. In preparation for the invasion of Sicily, the 82nd Airborne Division traveled by boat to the North African city of Casablanca. General Elmo Bell of Wiggins recalls the hot, arid countryside.
The vessel was a French luxury liner that had been leased by the government. The name of the vessel was the Monterey. It had been converted for use as a troop carrier. All the staterooms had been converted to bunk rooms, and the bunks were either 4 or 5 high. There was barely enough space between bunks, to turn over. You almost had to get out of bed to swap sides, and very, very crowded conditions. At that time, the German wolf pack was active, and there was a lot of concern about submarine attacks. And our convoy took a very devious route. We were aboard ship for 21 days, and we followed a storm front and took a very devious route to Casablanca. We had sailed up the coast of Casablanca for half a day without seeing any sign of inhabitation. And we were sure that it was Africa because we couldn't think of no other part of the world that was that desolate. And we felt that we had reached the end of the universe. But as we came off the gangplank at the pier, there were a number of young Red Cross ladies had coffee and donuts for us. And this was an unbelievable sight. We thought we were at the far end of the world, and here were some very attractive young ladies to serve coffee and donuts. And this was a big boost to our morale. The city of Casablanca was nothing like the movie. There was in fact, I didn't see any place in North Africa that was like the movie. And we were only in Casablanca a few days, and then we were boarded aboard little 40 and 8 cars that ran on a narrow gauge railroad and transported to Oujda. And this was a distance of several hundred miles. The average daily temperature in Africa was about 105 or 6. Now, it did get cool at night. The temperature at night would drop down in the low 60s. And it wasn't unusual for the temperature to reach 115 or 16 degrees. And we were attached to Patton's Corps. And at that time, we wore OD shirt and trousers. And they were impregnated to resist gas. And Patton, after we were attached to his corps, he required that we button the collar of our shirts and the cuffs of our sleeves. And we resented that big time. And that contributed a great deal to the misery of living in that climate. We had several forced marches that lasted a day and a night. And these were really an ordeal. We'd start out with 1 canteen of water. In fact, water was a problem all the way through. All the time that we were in Africa, water was rationed. They had a Lister bag in the company area that was filled up sometime during the night, and they had a guard on the Lister bag with a roster. And when the bag was refilled sometime during the night, the guard would be given a new roster. And when you filled your canteen, he drew a line through your name on the roster. So there was no source of any other water until the bag was filled again that next night. So we had 1 quart of water for every 24-hour period. And you could use that water to drink or to shave or to wash your socks or whatever purpose you wanted to use it for. So you can imagine how much shaving and sock washing happened.
On the night of July 9th, 1943, U.S. Army paratroopers parachuted behind enemy lines on the tiny island of Sicily. Separated and alone, Bell recounts the harrowing events that followed.
The drop zone was at Gila, and I dropped near Avola, which was about 25 miles away. All the troops were scattered to the length and breadth of the island. Many of the planes went all the way across the island and saw the sea on the other side and realized they'd overshot the drop zone. and turned around and came back about half the time distance across the island and released their sticks. We were well scattered, and in the briefing we were told that we didn't have to worry about tree landings, that there were no trees on Sicily tall enough for a parachute to hang up in. And I landed in a tree where my feet wouldn't touch the ground. And this was unbelievable after the briefing we had. And the first thing I did, I took my steel helmet off and dropped it to get an idea about the distance to the ground. And the helmet fell, making a series of sounds like it was falling through branches. And I thought I was in a tree taller than any Mississippi pine I'd ever seen. And I kept swinging, trying to reach a branch or the tree trunk or something, but I couldn't reach anything within the swing that I was able to create. I thought of deploying my reserve and cutting out of the harness and climbing the reserve chute down. But I realized when I got to the end of that canopy that I'd be committed, because I wouldn't be able to hang on that slick silk. And I had no idea how far that would be to the ground. So I just remained hanging there for many minutes. But as my night vision improved, I could tell that I was hanging beside a bank. Then I realized that my feet were no more than 4 feet off the ground. And this tree that my chute had caught on was an olive tree that was leaning out over this dry ravine. And I was hanging along the side of the ravine. And so I dropped out of my chute with no problem at all and left the chute and the harness hanging up there in the tree. And I had no idea where the other members of the stick were. But after I got on the ground and decided that the enemy troops were not using that ravine, that would be a good route to take. There was scattered small arms fire all around, and I could hear voices. And I had got out into an orchard when I heard the voices. And I went back to investigate these voices in the edge of the orchard. So I got back on the road, and there was a rock wall, and this rock fence was about, no, not quite waist high. And I crawled up behind that fence until I was even with this group. And they were Italian soldiers, and they were down on their knees with a map spread out that they were looking at with a dim flashlight. And after making absolutely certain that they were Italian soldiers, then I got my Tommy gun in firing position with the safety off and ready to shoot. And I took out a fragmentation hand grenade, although we were not supposed to use them until daylight. And I pulled the pin and let the handle fly off, and I counted 1,000, 2,000, threw the grenade over. Well, by giving it that delay, I think the grenade exploded before it hit the ground. And anyway, as soon as it exploded, then I raised up with my Tommy gun and I shot a burst at each one of them that moved, and there were either 4 or 5 of them in the group. Having done that, I reloaded with a fresh magazine. When I left there, I was concerned about my ammunition. The magazine that I had in my gun, when I shot several bursts, I took the remaining rounds out of it and threw it away and put those loose rounds in my pocket to conserve space. And I counted up, I had shot 18 rounds. And that was exactly 10% of my total combat load. And I started thinking, man, I've shot a tenth of my load and it's not daylight yet. My ammunition supply won't last till lunch. And that became a matter of great concern. And I started walking to another intense firefight in a different direction. I changed direction about 3 or 4 times. And then going to that direction, I crossed another dirt road. And then crossing that road, I came across the body of a dead paratrooper. And it was beginning to lighten up a little bit. It was just beginning to break day. And I looked to see if I could recognize him, but I couldn't. He had been shot in the face. His face was covered with blood, and I guess distorted too from the shot. And I couldn't recognize him. But he was armed with an M1. And I had already reached the conclusion that an M1 was needed in that open country. So I dropped my Tommy gun and ammunition there and took his cartridge belt and his M1. And I opened his M1 to see if it was one that had been zeroed, and it was. It had the tape inside it, and it was unloaded. And this bugged me. I wondered if he hadn't been admonished to not load his weapon, that if he might still be alive. And that contributed to my disdain for the instructions we had received.
After 15 years under fascist rule, the reactions of the Sicilians to Allied forces were mixed. Bell explains.
The politics in the island were somewhat surprising. Mussolini had been in power for some 16 or 18 years, and it was generally thought that the Sicilians were radical fascists, or rabid fascists, but they were not. In fact, the majority of the older people were opposed to the fascist party, and it was only the younger people who supported it. And this became more and more apparent as we moved about the island. The older people were very friendly and very helpful. The younger people were hostile in general, and we could expect no help from them at all. In fact, they would bear watching all the time. But the older people were very friendly and very helpful, and we used their donkeys frequently. The owners were very reluctant to release or to lose control of their burros, because they knew that once they were removed from their control, would lose their identity and they'd never be able to recover them again. So as a general rule, the owner insisted on going with the donkey. Didn't matter where he was going or how long it was going to take. The owner followed along behind, and at night he'd sit down and lean back against a tree so he could maintain vigilance over his donkey, and he'd stay with that donkey until he was no longer required, and then he'd depart with his donkey in tow with a big smile on his face. The jails were filled with political prisoners, and these people had, for the most part, had never even been charged with a crime, much less indicted and tried and sentenced. They were just held in jail, and many of them had been there for more than 10 years. And as we gained control of these towns, and by the way, we were regarded as liberators rather than conquerors, because in effect we were actually liberating the people from their own government. And frequently an army officer was appointed as military government officer to maintain control of each little municipality. And frequently the military government officer would declare martial law and free the political prisoners. And on the first occasion that I recall, and I believe this was at Ragusa, after the political prisoners were freed, one of them was almost beaten to death by the police. And after that came to light, then the police were locked in the jail. And it became almost standard procedure after that, as we liberated a village, to release the political prisoners and lock up the police. But the military government official had broad power. He could issue proclamations that were binding upon the people, and they did that frequently.
To hear more, visit MississippiMoments.org or just like us on Facebook. Mississippi Moments is supported by the Mississippi Humanities Council. The humanities are for everyone.